Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar of the two-part series on controlling Listeria in produce facilities and packing houses. Today you'll hear from Dr. Laura Strawn, who is an extension specialist and assistant professor of food science at Virginia Tech, and Genevieve Sullivan, who is a PhD candidate under Martin Weidman at Cornell University. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. In a few moments, I will post some links into the chat window for your references, and the presenters will both go over what each of these documents are in their presentations. You can also submit questions for the presenters at any time using the chat function, and Laura and Genevieve will answer as many as time allows at the end of the presentations. And then slide sets and recordings from the webinar will also be posted at the link on the bottom of your screen by the end of day today. And you can find the slide sets and recordings from the first webinar at this link as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Alex, and welcome to all who are Zooming in today from near and far. I did want to do a quick reminder that please do check out the recordings and the slide sets. They're available for use. And if you have any questions about needing the presentations, please reach out to us. We're hoping that most of you joined us during webinar 1. As such, we will not be providing much Listeria background as it was covered last time. And this way we'll have more time to discuss today's topics. The webinar today is going to cover 2 different parts. It's going to have the same format as last time. Part 1 will cover identification of risk factors, and part 2 on building an environmental monitoring program. And I think it's important that before we dive into an environmental monitoring program, that we note that control of Listeria can start before a single swab has been collected. From prior applied research and real-world data, we put together some foundational background on where Listeria may be likely in facilities and packing houses, and identification of risk factors that may be used to assist operators, managers, food safety professionals, all of you on the webinar today to prioritize Listeria control and or targeted swabbing. I would be remiss without a quick acknowledgement on part 1 that while most of the photos and slides are my own from years of extension work assisting the industry, a special thank you to Drs. Michelle Daniluk, Trevor Seslow, Faith Kreitzer, and Inez Haran for sharing a few others with me. A super quick Listeria recap for any of you on the Zoom that missed last week, which you should totally go back and listen to. It was fantastic. Listeria can be isolated from a diverse amount of sources: soil, water, employee shoes, ATMs. Listeria can also multiply over a range of temperatures. There's been data shown growth can be observed anywhere from negative 1.5 to 45 Celsius. And it can adapt in a variety of stressors. And it can also persist for long periods in the environment. There are some studies that have shown certain Listeria can persist in a processing plant for up to 10 years. And Listeria monocytogenes is the Listeria species capable of causing foodborne illness in humans. It has been the cause of many produce product recalls. In fact, over 40 have occurred since 2016. And it's really the bad actor that we want to keep out of our facilities, and that brings us today all on the Zoom. 2 things that I want us all to think about over the course of the next hour and to really keep in the forefront is, what is the likelihood of harborage, as well as what is the likelihood of cross-contamination or transfer? These two tenets will help you prioritize what gets done, or in reality, what gets done first, right? As sometimes it's not feasible to accomplish everything on your list. I also think these two questions can assist in terms of sanitary design elements, addressing sanitation, as well as other factors or things. And so we want to always think back to these: the likelihood of harborage and the likelihood of cross-contamination when we think about risk factors or anything to do with Listeria control. What makes Listeria control in produce so challenging, I think, is the diverse spectrum of facilities and packing houses. We see things from open to enclosed environments. We could have a pole barn with a roof but no sidewalls, to a state-of-the-art sanitary design facility. And each of these operations is going to have its own set of external and internal pressures that impact Listeria. In the pictures, you can see that there are different challenges associated with these two operations in terms of Listeria control. Often packing houses and facilities, they weren't built with sanitation in mind. And many have materials that are hard to clean. And additionally, some can be located in remote areas or very, very rural areas where sanitation services aren't available. And I think that's why it's so important to empower and educate all, and I mean everybody, on Listeria, as controls need to be tailored to the actual operation that you're working in or that you're helping. We're going to go through a series of risk factors, and these are not exhaustive by any means, but they're a place to get you started. And we're going to discuss them a little bit, and then we're going to kind of talk a little bit about what can we do to control Listeria. So our first risk factor is the outside environment. And contamination from the outside environment, this includes the pre-harvest production environment, this includes the property, is likely to be low. We know that from research, but we expect Listeria to be present sporadically, and it could potentially be transferred. And it's a challenge to exclude potential harborage sites. So if product or equipment, trucks or harvesters, tools, knives, harvest bins, or other miscellaneous items, this could be a worker boot, become contaminated in the field or another place, they could be contaminated by soil or water or feces or a number of things. It is possible for contamination to be introduced into a facility or a packing house. I think that's important that we understand that. And we might expect to find things, and that's not necessarily bad. It just means that we have to do some control. And that's why it's so vital for operators to assess their operations vulnerability for Listeria. Again, that'll be different depending on the operation, and that way we can manage risk. So here, Listeria control should start at the field by implementing GAPs, a good agricultural practices program, training workers to minimize dirt and debris on containers and tools and equipment that enter the packing house and or the facility. Listeria control should also include or be thought of at the property line. And this can be as simple as keeping the grounds tidy outside the packing house or the facility, mowing lawns, picking up litter. We don't want to give unwanted pests an opportunity to enter your operation, right? Or a harborage area. Another risk factor is the building or building's design basic elements. And this could be anywhere from cracked or broken epoxy floor coatings, degraded concrete, holes or openings in the facility, floors that aren't sloped towards drains or solid or cleanable, poor drainage, harborage areas, and so forth on the list. And here, what we really want to think about is we want to create an environment that's easy to maintain in the required sanitary condition that we need. Ideally, we like to select materials that are easy to clean. We like to design for the expected lifespan of the facility, it's especially the flooring. And some of these recommendations cost money to the operation. And therefore, we really want to develop a working list of items that need to be replaced or renovated so we can prioritize and be ready when opportunities present to fix. I think that that is really critical. You can have a great idea of where your weaknesses are and be ready to kind of incrementally attack them. Another risk factor is drains. And whether you ask experts, Google, or read the literature, drains are a common Listeria harborage site. And when we think about drains, we want to think about two main things. We want to prevent cross-contamination, so prevent from whatever's in the drain to getting to other areas. Here we can avoid pressurized washers to clean the drains. We can designate brushes. We can have a management plan and SOPs to minimize clogged or backed up drains. The other thing we can do is keep Listeria out of our drains in the first place. And that is all going to go back to sanitation and a sanitation program. Things that can help that sanitation program, rotate sanitizers. We can clean and sanitize drains more frequently. A lot of this will be based on your operation size or your volume of product. Our other risk factor is equipment and equipment design and basic elements. And this is similar to our thoughts on buildings. But here what we really want to do is think about the cleanability of the piece of equipment. Have any modifications been done to it? Exposed screws as fasteners, Teflon tape, duct tape. Are there entrapment of debris? Crack belts, frayed or exposed edges. We really want to think about dead legs from wash systems or flumes. We've all walked in a facility and thought, where does that go? It goes to nowhere. We also really want to think about the long-term exposure to sanitizers. How is that equipment going to hold up? And in the pictures on the slide, I've given some examples, and I think we've all seen these, right? You know, the use of too much tape to fix something, or a screw where this, you know, they can be very difficult to clean and sanitize. In between or on that brush roller system below, there's some Teflon tape there that it's accumulated moisture. And so one thing to think about is reducing number of brush beds to what's essential for quality. We want to think about things like that. Another risk factor can be poor or rough welds. And this can be a source of entrapment points. We want to avoid lap welds. Instead, we want to opt for a butt weld or a smoother weld. In the picture, you can see a weld on a flume, and it's pretty rough, right? There are entrapment points there, and it will be difficult to clean and sanitize unless, especially when we're thinking about speed at times. And another risk factor is pre-coolers and cold storage rooms. And here, these are not always built with cleaning and sanitizing in mind. They can be cold and wet. And these environments are Listeria friendly. We have to think about pests, insects and birds and rodent vectors. Storage bins and forklifts may bring potential contamination into that environment, where then it might be able to survive or grow. Air handling systems may spread contamination. Cooling coils, they're hard to clean, and sometimes we see a lot of spray-on insulation. We can see damage from forklifts and water. And the controls here around Listeria are really some simple and some more complicated. So simple ones would be develop SOPs not to place product under condensers. And that sounds very simple in theory, but I've got a picture on the screen where there was product under there before we moved it. We also want to think about maintenance of cracks and chips and floors and walls. And these things can be a little bit more on the expensive side. And then the side of, well, are they going to happen again? So thinking of things and what you can do to prevent that. Improve drainage and management of moisture. And that really brings us into our next risk factor, which is condensation or pooled water. And this could be dripping condensation in coolers, condensation on cold curtains and floors, runoff from bin dumps and flumes and other sources. And the Listeria controls include substituting out cold curtains when possible, limiting areas prone to pooling of water. If we can't limit those areas, can we try and allow these areas to dry out? A lot of research on the produce side has shown that if we can allow, or we have a dry area, we don't find as much Listeria there than maybe a wet area. Can we reduce condensation conducive conditions? This may be possible, this may not, but it's something to think about. Another risk factor is product flow. And on the screen, you have a diagram of preferences for product flow directions from poor all the way to best. And again, this is another one that sounds easy, right? Product flow, but it can be complex for produce operations, as high care areas may not always be internal or be able to be worked out in this linear fashion. A lot of product goes in and out of storage and cold storage and different areas in a produce facility or a packing house. Controls around Listeria here, we want to limit traffic of workers and equipment or tools from the field into the packing house, or in general. This could be challenging because of forklifts and bins, right? Here, what we really want to do with your individual operation is for you to think about, how can we reduce opportunities for that cross-contamination here? Another risk factor is tools, equipment, and items that move. And this by no means is an exhaustive list, but includes things like forklifts and bins and squeegees to get rid of pooled water, brushes, mops, fans that are used to move about the facility when it gets hot in the summer to cool employees down, chairs, tables, trash cans, carts, other various things. And we really want to pay attention here to these items that move between the outside and the inside, as introduction of Listeria from outside sources is possible. I think we've made the case that it is possible. And similar to prior risk factors, Listeria control here is focused on altering or limiting traffic patterns or movement when possible. Would we all like to have forklifts that can be designated in certain areas? We would, and sometimes that's possible and sometimes that's not. The other thing with these items is sanitation. And when Genevieve talks about an environmental monitoring program, some of these items might be identified in that environmental monitoring program. And then is there a sanitation program or protocol that could you put in place to limit Listeria? Another risk factor is hollow items. And these are difficult to clean and sanitize. They allow potential buildup of organic matter. They often can retain moisture. When we think about hollow items, this could be railings, tables, or with a hollow leg, a cap that's fallen off. It could be even a bumper stop that would prevent a forklift from hitting a piece of equipment or a wall. And Listeria control here is really the avoidance of these items, right? If you can. And if you can't, is there repairs or modifications to these items that can limit potential Listeria harborage? We also want to think, if we make a modification, how is that modification going, again, to affect likelihood of harborage and likelihood of cross-contamination? Another risk factor is employees. And it's not really the people per se, it's the lack of employee training on routes of cross-contamination. Things happen when you aren't watching. And Listeria controls here are all going to be tied back to training workers. Training workers to understand Listeria and its importance, potential harborage sites. What can they do to limit Listeria? For example, avoiding cross-contamination scenarios. And in these trainings, it might be helpful to show pictures. It might be helpful to have scenarios that people can talk through. In the picture, you can see a worker resting on the steps with gloved hands, touching the floor, and talking about why that is or why that isn't a good idea. You also can offer or give people the opportunities to go to advanced trainings for managers or supervisors or motivated employees. And this really just gives you more eyes and people who understand. A lot of things about adult education and adult learning have to do with the why. So if people understand the why, they learn better. To kind of wrap up this part one, Listeria control certainly can be challenging. There are a lot of unique operations out there in terms of open or closed facilities. They're all a little bit different in terms of age, even the surrounding environment and what are those pressures. We could be in a rural environment, we could be in an urban setting. Those are all things to think about. And there are several steps, I think, that a packing house and a facility can take to minimize Listeria. One of the first things as an extension specialist, when I go out to work with the industry, is to map out the facility and the packing house and the flow of product. This will allow you to assess the operations vulnerability. You can kind of take everything that we've covered today without even taking a single swab and think, where are the holes, you know? For example, do you have hollow items or equipment or tools that move between inside and outside of the facility? Are there areas prone to pooling of water? The next one is to implement and or refine sanitation SOPs. If you don't have a sanitation program, start one. They can be simple. Start one in the areas that are likely to potentially come in contact with food or that are likely to have harborage or cross-contamination. If you already have a sanitation program, we can always refine it. We can always make it more robust. The next thing would be, and it leads us into our part two, which is probably what you guys are all on the phone waiting for, is to develop that environmental monitoring program. And they can be simple and sophisticated. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve, and she will talk to you about environmental monitoring programs.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully that works. Okay. So let's see if I can get rid of this. Drag it out. Okay, that's what I'll do. Okay, so today, as Laura mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about building an effective environmental monitoring program. And she really set it up nicely to kind of give us an overview of the risk factors that we need to be aware of as we're building that program. And just as a reminder, this is going to be very general, just to sort of get you started. But if there's something that you want to learn more about today, or if you're at the point where you really want to make sure that you're building up your own program and you want more details, there's a ton of resources available. I'll show a few, and Alex, our moderator and speaker from last week, she's popping them into the chat box right now. So the first one is from United Fresh, and it's the second edition. So if you have read the first edition from a few years ago, this is a newer one, and that's general guidance on environmental monitoring for Listeria specifically, and it's also for the fresh produce industry. So you may have seen other documents that are helpful for ready-to-eat foods, but this one is specific to produce, so definitely check that out. And in addition, United Fresh actually just came out with a new document that's specific to packing houses, actually. So if you fall into the category where you consider yourself a packing house, maybe by definition you're a facility, but in principle you do the packing of fruit, definitely check out that document as well. If you would like some more information on different types of sampling and environmental monitoring beyond Listeria, another good resource is the 3M Environmental Monitoring Handbook. This also just came out, I think a few months ago, and it's completely free. You can download it online. And so Alex put that in the chat box already, I believe. And this kind of gives you an overview of some other things that you might want to monitor for. So in addition to Listeria, it also talks about Salmonella, and it also talks about ATP, swabbing, and things like that. And lastly, I also wanted to point out the draft guidance. So this was released by FDA. These are non-binding recommendations. This is a draft. It's not necessarily required, but it is what the government would like to see. So it's definitely a good place to look for more information on Listeria. And it's not specific to produce, but again, it just has a lot of good information on there. So today I'm going to go through this sort of outline talking about the goals, identifying testing zones. So when you're doing your sampling, you want to sample in different zones. So we'll talk about that. Where you want to sample and also where not to sample, because we know you have limited resources, so you don't really have an opportunity to sample every single thing. Going to talk about what to test for. Should you test for Listeria species, or should you only test for Listeria monocytogenes? A swab plan, how to collect samples, selecting a lab, and how do you respond when you do get a positive, or alternatively, how do you respond when you're not getting any positives and you think you should be? And keep in mind that both Dr. Strawn and I, Laura and I, can probably give a presentation, a full-length presentation on each one of these bullets individually. So again, this is very much an overview to kind of give you an introduction. So for the goals of an environmental monitoring program, EMP, the first goal is to verify the effectiveness of your control programs. So the monitoring should be done over time, and it should really make sure that whatever you're doing to control the risk factors that Laura was talking about, are your controls working? So for example, let's say you've got a really good sanitation program, but then all of a sudden you have a new employee come in who doesn't do their job as well on the sanitation shift, and you realize that there's a spike in Listeria because of that. This program allows you to catch that and retrain or figure out the cause to make sure you're actually controlling Listeria. The second goal is to find the harborage sites if they are present in your plant. So a harborage site is basically a place where Listeria goes to and can grow and survive even through cleaning and sanitation. And when it does that, it becomes what's called a niche. So we want to make sure we're finding any places in your operation where Listeria is able to survive cleaning and sanitation and get rid of them. So either you might have to disassemble equipment, you might have to clean and sanitize a little bit more carefully in that area, you might have to replace equipment or modify it in some way so that you're getting rid of the harborage sites, or at the very least monitoring them. And the third goal is to ensure that your corrective actions have addressed Listeria species, Listeria monocytogenes when you find it. So for example, if you find Listeria positive, your environmental monitoring program should be set up in a way that you continue to test that area until you're assured that the problem has been taken care of. And this sort of leads us into the question of transient versus persistent Listeria. So in general, your program is going to be looking for Listeria no matter what kind it is, but we sort of split it up into these two types because transient Listeria is what we refer to when a Listeria comes into your operation, whether it's on the product itself or maybe it's on an employee's footwear or something like that. But your controls are good and they take care of that Listeria, and it's a one-time thing and you never see it again. So that may be that cleaning and sanitation, for example, takes care of it that night. Or maybe someone was wearing it on the Listeria was on the bottom of their shoe, but then they walked through a foot bath, which was able to take care of the Listeria. What's a greater concern, though, is what we call resident or persistent Listeria. And that's where it's repeatedly found. So we know this through DNA, whole genome sequencing, and different subtyping methods, that some Listeria can survive in operations over time for weeks and months and even years. And that's the one that you've got to be concerned about, because that's usually the stuff that's finding a place to hide in your operations and is avoiding the cleaning and sanitation crew. It's found, let's say, a floor crack or a sandwich juncture, and it's able to get in there, and sanitizer cannot, for example. And so that's the stuff we want to look for and get rid of. Because if persistent Listeria is able to grow, it's able to continually recontaminate your food product. So here's an example of what that looks like. So we have three plants here: plant B, plant C, and plant D. And these are three real-life operations that are about 10 miles from each other. And there was several hundred samples, sponge samples, taken to look for Listeria at these three operations. And along the left-hand side on that column there, you can see different types of Listeria. This is ribotyping, but there's other ways to figure out the subtype of a Listeria. And you can see that there's several what are called persistent Listeria in red. So plant D, for example, they have a 10% prevalence of this one Listeria type that the other two plants didn't have at all. So that's what we call a PET. It's unique to this plant. Whereas, for example, down here, Listeria type 1062, that was found in all three facilities and at very low prevalence. So chances are that's something transient that just happened to come in and has moved on. So when you're doing your swabbing and when you're doing your sample collection, you want to sort of split it into different testing zones. And what I mean by that, or as a refresher for those of you who already are familiar, zone 1s are food contact surfaces. So we're talking about your conveyor belts, anything that's used to modify the product, like slicers or choppers or scorers or anything like that. And these are definitely high risk for contaminating the product if you have an issue there. Zone 2 is not food contact, but it's in close proximity to food contact. So any of the framework that's by the conveyor belts, for example, and things directly next to food contact surfaces. Zone 3 is a little bit more remote, a little bit farther away, but it's still in the general area. So things like forklifts, carts, floors, and drains, those are all considered Zone 3. And then lastly, we have Zone 4, and these are non-food contact surfaces that are outside of the processing area. So we're talking about the break room, the locker rooms, things that aren't in the food processing area. Now, how many samples should you take in each of these zones? In general, we say to focus on zones 2 and 3. We want to make sure we're catching Listeria before it gets to the food contact surfaces. So those are really going to have the most meaning in an environmental monitoring program. Zone 4 is good for fresh cut, especially if you're finding that you're doing really well in your processing area and you want to expand a little bit to challenge yourself to see, okay, is there any way we can see what's going on in Zone 4 and do our best to ensure that it's not getting from Zone 4 to Zone 3. It does not have much meaning for packing houses, not saying that you can't do it, but in terms of packing houses, there's a lot of scenarios where employees wear the same footwear in the break room as they do in the processing area, so there's not much use for that. And as for Zone 1, that I'm going to quote United Fresh webinar on that. That requires thoughtful preparation. So this Zone 1 issue, a lot of people ask us, well, should I sample Zone 1? Should I do that? And so United Fresh actually did an hour-long webinar on this, I think last week or the week before. So we're going to post that link in the chat box if we have not already. And that I would highly recommend you check out, because we don't want you to just think, oh, I should do Zone 1 and then go out and do it tomorrow. You know, you have to actually put some thought into that, just because the consequences of doing that are pretty serious. So you gotta think about that. In terms of where you should sample, we generally say wet, relatively undisturbed areas. It's not always the case, but that's a good place to start. For produce, we generally say areas that may trap organic material and are difficult to access. So things like floor cracks and catch pans and anything like that where you're going to have organic material build up. And the last one here is overlapping materials. So anytime you have like a sandwich juncture, which basically means, you have stainless steel against a floor or stainless steel against stainless steel, where you have this small area where Listeria can get in, but cleaning and sanitation cannot. And here are some more examples I put down here. These are sampling locations that Laura and I have both seen to be issues in produce operations specifically. Not to say that they aren't difficult sites in other operations. So you can see a lot of examples here. And again, these slides will be posted, so you'll have more access to this. I also put a few that were specific to packing houses. Some of these are redundant, but I just wanted to have sort of a separate list for that, especially the dump tank area, just because in produce operations, the dump tank area, especially in packing houses, it's very, very wet, and that's great for Listeria. We tend to have a lot of Listeria positives in that area more than any other spot. So I'm just going to go through a few pictures of where the types of sites you might want to be looking at. So this, for example, is a door that opens into a flume. And you can see around the edge here, there's actually a rubber seal to help keep the water in. And so we actually found Listeria between this rubber and seal here. So this is an example of something that, maybe if they open it up during cleaning and sanitation, that might help clean this particular site. Or alternatively, they might have to find some other way to kind of seal this off besides this sort of rubber seal. Here's an example of sort of a sandwich juncture where you have sort of a nice flat against flat surface, so that you can see that the water is getting underneath here. So chances are Listeria is going to be able to get into these little areas and cause a problem, whereas your cleaning and sanitation might not be able to do as well there. So you got to be aware of those. I've started to see people using quat powder around the legs of equipment and have seen some success with that. Here's an example of a catch pan that drains into this PVC pipe, which goes into this drain. There's a couple of issues here. You can see a pretty big floor crack here. You can see that this is actually a dead-end pipe, so there's not constant water moving through there. And even within the catch pan, there's actually a joint right here where the catch pans meet each other. So these are all little places where Listeria is going to be able to hang out. These are all called harborage points, and once Listeria ends up in there, it's called a niche, and so you want to be aware of those. Again, Laura talked about welding. We're just basically showing pictures here that sort of demonstrate a lot of the risk factors that Laura mentioned. Here's underneath a brush bed, so you can see this is an area with organic material, and you're going to have a lot of opportunity for transient Listeria, so you want to also be aware of the areas where you might have a harborage point that's not getting cleaned. And none of these places are particularly good sampling sites unless you sample them correctly. So a lot of people are trained to do sort of a 10 by 10 inch area. And when you're trained to do that, you sort of go for something flat and easy. But what we really want to stress is that you really want to get into the place where you think you're most likely to find Listeria. So instead of picking one side or the other, we would actually recommend, for example, using this floor crack that's right through the middle here. That may be a higher risk for having Listeria than this flat surface over here above or below this. So keep in mind that when you're looking at any individual site, you want to look for the spot within the site that you think you have the greatest chance of catching Listeria where it's able to survive regular cleaning and sanitation. And lastly, here's a picture of a drain. So for example, let's say you have a sampling site list and the site list says drain. When I first saw this drain, it looked like the cover couldn't be removed. Turns out it just took 2 of us to do it. And it turned out it was a very deep drain, so you have to sort of get on your hands and knees and actually get into the drain to collect your sample. So it's sort of tempting to just take the swab at the top of the drain or along the sides here, but there's a PVC pipe leading into this drain, which was where we identified might be the greatest problem. So when you're choosing where to sample, you want to also think about corrective actions. So you got to make sure you have corrective actions that you can do for each possible site in general. So for example, if you have a positive in a drain, do you have a more stringent drain drain cleaning program that you can use. If you don't have a corrective action, then you might want to consider why you don't. So for example, if you decide that your brush bed rollers are high risk, and you're worried about them being positive, if you're going to take a sample there, do you have a plan of what to do if they are positive? Think about the likelihood of being positive. You want to make sure you're taking the majority of your samples in areas that are more likely to be positive, and also think about the likelihood of contaminating product. What to test for? So if Listeria species can become entrenched in a niche, so can Listeria monocytogenes. So we generally say that Listeria species is more conservative and it can generally get you the information faster. But if you do that, we want to make sure that you're treating Listeria species as if it were monocytogeny, so as if it were pathogenic. And based on our research, we know that about 60% of Listeria positive samples actually contain the pathogenic Listeria. So make sure you're treating that Listeria species as monocytogenes. For your master swab plan, when you're thinking about frequency for packing houses, we recommend at least monthly if you can. For fresh cut, we usually recommend it's a little bit more frequently, weekly. For quantity, really depends on the size of the facility, the end use, and your prior trending. For packing houses, we hope for about 10 sponges at a time. For fresh cut, you're going to want more than that. And again, all of these slides are going to be available afterwards. Time, we generally recommend 3 to 4 hours into production. Unless you have repeat positives, that's when you want to do it after cleaning and sanitation. And you can definitely composite, but make sure you're going low risk to high risk. You don't want to swab the floor and then swab a table with the same sponge. We generally recommend hydrated sponges. Here's an example of those. I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to fly through these last few slides. I've also seen the Hygiena Insight at a number of places. I'm not necessarily recommending or not recommending this, I just have seen this. The one thing you have to be careful about with this is that it's a very low surface area. So keep in mind that you might want to also do sponges to kind of check in on how well you're able to capture your Listeria prevalence with these Hygiena swabs. I've also heard people having luck with a 3M MDS. And again, I'm not saying that these are the ones you should necessarily go for. These are just ones that I've been seeing. And when you're selecting a lab to do your testing, if you have to send it out, just make sure it's an ISO accredited lab with AOAC approved methods. And I've got a few listed here that are regional, but there's definitely other labs nationwide. So for responding to Listeria, you want to examine the site and investigate potential causes. How likely is it that the detection of that site is the transient Listeria, not persistent? You want to look at trending. Has it been detected around the site before, and in which zone was it detected? You want to look at, you want to hopefully have a flow chart for what to do when you do have positives. You should always have a plan in place for what do you do if you have one positive, what do you have to do if you have 2 in a row, 3 in a row. Make sure you have that laid out. And we'll skip through this and take vector swabs if you have to. Don't be afraid to do that, because this is an investment in your product's safety. And make sure you review your results over time. So make sure that you're aware that if you have a positive during 1 month, did you have a positive there on previous sampling rounds? And if you do have consistent repeat positives, why is that happening? Make sure you're very organized, have it all in one spot along with your corrective actions. And at the end of the year, try to do a regular review of your testing results. See if there's any long-term trends, and see if you can get some other people from the operation involved in this. Get someone from operations, someone from cleaning and sanitation, someone from maintenance, and talk about the trends and what might be causing some of those. And make sure your corrective actions go beyond deep cleaning. So the take-home messages: the packing house and facility environment is an important source of foodborne pathogens. Those environmental sources, as Laura mentioned, are a particular source for Listeria. Good pathogen environmental monitoring programs are set up to find pathogens, not to show that there are no problems. So if you're finding that you're doing a lot of environmental testing and you're not finding any Listeria positives, that's probably an indication that you need to look in different spots or use a different test sponge kit or something like that. And sampling will not control your food safety hazards. It's the actions taken after that will. So it's great to take a whole lot of sponge samples, but if you're not going to do anything about the positive results, then that's not a good use of your resources. You want to make sure that you have resources in place to actually do the corrective actions. And with that, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. You can feel free to send them into the chat box, and I put our emails up here too, as well as Alex's, who spoke last week.
All right, thank you, Genevieve and Laura. Those were both incredible presentations. Before we begin with the question answer session, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and we hope you enjoyed the presentations and learned something that you can bring back to your facilities. I would also like to remind everyone that that they will be able to access the recordings and the slide sets from both of the webinars from the series on the Cornell Food Safety Lab website under the Links tab. And we encourage you to share these materials from anyone within your company or organization that may find them useful. And a few attendees had posted the link earlier on in the chat, but I'll repost it because I think it's buried now. So we can get going on the question answer session. Okay. Do you have any guidance for super swab protocols to set up for PEM programs or to deal with investigations?
Yes, so was the question super swab? Is that what it's called? I'm not familiar with that term, so I'm assuming it's something similar to a swabathon.
That's what I took it as.
So yes, in terms of those, we do recommend those if you can and have the resources to do that, to go and do some intensified sampling where you look beyond your normal sampling plan, and do that perhaps once or twice a year if you can. I guess the recommendation I would make about that is it's really helpful when you have an outside pair of eyes. So get someone who is either at the corporate level, if that's an option, or grab another person who's not normally in the operation to go with the swabber to help pick out sites, and hopefully they are understanding of what sort of sites they should be looking for. They should have at least that background, or have an outside expert come in if you can do that. Because a lot of times when I go into different operations, and I'm sure Laura has similar experience, is that you sort of point out things that have been there for a long time that the facility doesn't notice anymore, that they don't realize is an issue because they just see it every day. So I guess my main recommendation for that would be to get an outside pair of eyes if you can. But we definitely would recommend doing swabathons if you can, because it does give you a lot of information at once.
It looks like we had a question about thoughts on sanitizing prior to swabbing. I recognize a lot of manufacturers are washing, rinsing, sanitizing, and swabbing. Thoughts? And I think here it really depends on, when you do your environmental monitoring or your swabbing, what is the question that you're wanting to answer. If you have no idea what to expect or where your vulnerabilities lie, we really are recommending that you do that 3 or 4 hours into the operation, so you can target and kind of figure out where are your weaknesses, where are your vulnerabilities, where are potentially those harborage sites that could lead to cross-contamination. If you are sanitizing prior to swabbing, I think then you're getting into verification activities of your sanitation program. And you're getting into kind of a more refined look at that, where you're not necessarily saying, I need to find where my weaknesses are. You kind of already know because you've already developed some type of sanitation program. And now you're really checking to make sure it's actually working. So I would go with, it depends on the question that you want to ask and why you're swabbing in the first place.
Thank you, Laura. So the next question, are there any suggestions on how to share the results with your associates in management? For instance, percent positives, mapping.
I will quickly interject that from my experience, when you're working with your team, I think a lot of times they like to see a map. So if you have a facility or a packing house map and you can map those positives on it to kind of talk about it, I think a lot of people are visual, and that way you don't have any kind of language barriers or whatnot. And it also helps that when you talk about those results, that you pair that with the why, right? Why is this important? Why is Listeria an issue? Why, what do we think happened here? What can we do to prevent it? Even letting, as a group, people come up with suggestions on how to come up with strategies for mitigations or interventions. I think that really goes for the team approach and helps with a general understanding and importance of why and what can we do as a team to make sure that we control Listeria.
All right, great. So the next question is, my risk assessment and HACCP plan doesn't demonstrate a need for environmental monitoring because it's low risk. Do I still have to implement an environmental monitoring program? In this case, they are repacking or a repacking facility, so there's no processing or cutting the product.
Yeah, I guess I mean it depends on what's actually happening and if the product is exposed. I'm imagining that this is a pretty dry onion packing house. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure without seeing it. If there were water, for example, I would think about Listeria, but it is low risk. Most onions are cooked unless there's a new trend for onion smoothies or something like that. So I would think, and if it is a dry operation, you might want to consider salmonella, but I would think that you wouldn't need to do that. But I'm not sure, Laura, if you have other opinions on that.
Yeah, I also think it really depends on where you fall in FSMA. It sounds like you might fall under produce safety rule, which doesn't necessarily require environmental monitoring programs. And then the other thing to think of beyond the FSMA regulations is your audit and if they require it or not. And that really is a kind of a gambit based on how sophisticated you get with some of your audit programs.
All right, great. So the next one. Say you're a relatively small grower or packer, you don't have a lot of resources, but would like to start doing some environmental monitoring. Would you recommend one sampling session with lots of samples or few samples repeated over the season?
So I think this is going to vary based on who you ask. If you want my opinion, I would say I recommend, since this is a small grower packer, they may or may not have a very sophisticated sanitation program. I would say that I would start with doing an environmental sampling or swabbing with a lot of swabs one time, 3 to 4 hours into operation to identify those vulnerabilities and those weaknesses of areas that I need to target. Now, if you had told me that maybe they have a very sophisticated sanitation program and food safety program, I might alter my opinion, but I think I probably would recommend the one-time lot of swabs and identify those areas and where you need to kind of focus your efforts.
Yeah.
It's a numbers game for me, because if you take a few amount of swabs, chances are you're not going to find anything.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that we've observed that the Listeria prevalence over the course of a packing season seems to increase. So during the summertime or whenever your off season is, your operation gets a chance to dry out a little bit, and that's means that your Listeria prevalence in general goes down. So keep in mind that if you do a more intensified swabbing at the beginning of your season, it doesn't mean that you're golden for the rest of the seasons. Hopefully that doesn't make things more complicated.
All right, so if you are just a cold storage, how often should you swab?
I think this one again is really going to be sort of more information, right? So if you have, again, it probably depends on how much product is going in and out. Is that cold storage having any kind of drainage issues where there's water, or any kind of pooling of water? Have you been environmental monitoring or swabbing? If you have sort of a maintenance program, I would say you could probably, I think Genevieve in her presentation recommended about 10 swabs. If you've, again, never done any kind of environmental monitoring, I would always start with that more swabathon type approach to begin, to sort of figure out where you need to go in terms of your sanitation and some of your controls.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that a little bit. That's a tricky question, because part of me thinks that there's less of a need at just pure cold storage. But as Laura said, I mean, if you have identified issues, if you have condensation, if you have poor drainage and things like that, that's definitely going to be a risk for anyone who you supply to. So definitely be aware of that. Be aware of the risks that Laura mentioned, and if you see a lot of those risks, then that's when you start to have to consider more carefully the need for a sampling plan.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting close to 2 o'clock, so we only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. But if we aren't able to get to your questions, you can stay on the webinar and we'll try and respond to all of them through the chat function when we're done. So the next one, we're going back to the dry onion packing houses. Would you consider if they are conducting wet sanitation activities?
So I guess as soon as you enter water into the equation, you're going to be increasing your risk there. So definitely be aware of that. We recommend dry cleaning as much as you can in any operation to keep things dry. Just because as soon as you start entering water, you just up your risk for Listeria and its potential to grow. So yeah, I'm not quite sure the full question, but I would be more concerned if I knew that there was water regularly entering into the area.
All right, we'll do one quick question. So is swabbing for cleaning verification or sanitation verification more important?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, if we're looking for cleaning or if it's for sanitation. So when I think of sanitation, I think of both cleaning and sanitizing. When I think of that, I also think that cleaning should be about 75 to 80% of it, and sanitizing is the less intensive part, just because you can't sanitize dirt. So you got to make sure that your cleaning is really good, and that your sanitizing is sort of secondary. Your swabbing is to verify both of those things. So you need to clean well, and you also need to sanitize in order to get rid of Listeria. If I think this question might slightly be confusing because you might be asking for ATP testing, and that's a little bit different because that's to verify cleaning, depending on who you ask. So I don't know if I made that answer more confusing than intended, but Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Oops, sorry, I muted myself. No, I was going to answer something very similar in terms of, I think of sanitation the same way as cleaning and sanitizing. So in this particular case, it would be both.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Again, if we weren't able to get to one of your questions, you can stay on for a little while, and we'll try and answer them. We'll also, I'll copy all the questions that we have left in the chat, and I will post them on that link that also has the webinar and recordings on it. So thank you all for attending.